For 3,000 years, millions of people have believed in something extraordinary. They have been told that the God who created the entire universe, the God who made the stars and the oceans and every living thing on earth, looked down at all the nations and all the peoples across the world and chose one, just one, the Jewish people. This belief is not small. It is not something whispered quietly in corners. It is written in sacred texts. It is sung in prayers. It is taught to children. It has shaped wars, inspired art, and given meaning to countless lives. The idea that God personally selected the Jews as his chosen people, his treasured possession above all others, has survived empires, outlasted kingdoms, and endured through the darkest moments of human history. But what if I told you that this entire belief, this cornerstone of identity that has defined Judaism for thousands of years, was never actually a message from God? What if I told you that a Jewish philosopher, using nothing but pure logic and careful study of religious texts, proved that the concept of being chosen by God was not a divine gift at all? What if he showed that it was something else entirely? Something created by human hands, built by human minds, designed for very human purposes? And what if I told you that when he revealed this truth, his own community tried to kill him for it? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is not someone's angry opinion about religion. This is the work of one of the most brilliant minds in human history, a man who studied the Torah more carefully than almost anyone before him, who knew Hebrew, who understood Jewish law inside and out. His name was Baruch Spinoza, and what he discovered about Judaism shook the foundations of religious belief so violently that his books were banned, burned in public squares, and condemned by priests and rabbis alike for over 200 years. The Catholic Church called his work evil. The Jewish community expelled him with the harshest curse ever written. A fanatic even tried to stab him to death outside a synagogue. Why? Because Spinoza asked one simple question that no one was supposed to ask. If God is truly infinite, if God is truly everywhere, if God is truly the creator of everything that exists, then how can God possibly choose one group of people over all others? Does that not make God sound less like an infinite creator and more like a human king picking his favorite subjects? That question led Spinoza down a path that would change everything. He began examining the holy texts, not with blind faith, but with careful reasoning. And what he found was shocking. He found contradictions that could not be explained if God had written the texts. He found historical fingerprints that showed when and why certain beliefs were created. He found evidence that the concept of being chosen was not handed down from heaven, but built up from earth during specific moments of crisis when the Jewish people needed something powerful to hold on to. He discovered that the idea of divine election was not a cosmic truth but a brilliant survival strategy, a way for a small, threatened community to maintain its identity against overwhelming odds. And he proved it so thoroughly, with such clear logic and such careful evidence, that even his enemies could not refute his arguments. They could only try to silence him. But here is what makes this story even more important. Spinoza was not trying to destroy Judaism. He was not filled with hate. He was not trying to hurt anyone. He was simply searching for truth, following the evidence wherever it led, even when it led to the most dangerous conclusion imaginable. And the conclusion he reached was this: the Jewish people were not chosen by God, but that does not make them less valuable. It does not make their history less meaningful. It does not erase their contributions to the world. What it does is something far more profound. It reveals how humans create meaning, how communities survive, how power works, and how religious beliefs serve very specific purposes in very specific moments. Spinoza showed that the story of being chosen was not a lie told by evil men. It was a necessary fiction, a powerful narrative that helped a small people survive when they should have disappeared into history like so many other ancient tribes. Now, you might be thinking, why does this matter? Why should anyone care what one philosopher said 350 years ago? Here is why. Because the pattern Spinoza exposed in Judaism is not unique to Judaism. It appears everywhere. Every nation, every religion, every powerful group has claimed at some point that they are special, that they are chosen, that God or history or destiny favors them above others. Americans have called their country a city on a hill, blessed by God with a special mission. Europeans used the idea of being civilized and chosen by progress to justify colonizing the world. Religious extremists today, whether Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, use the same logic. We are chosen, we are special, we are right, they are not. And that belief, that sense of divine favor has been used to justify crusades, slavery, genocides, and wars throughout all of human history. Spinoza gave us a tool to see through all of it. He showed us that whenever someone claims God chose them, we should ask a different question. Who benefits from this belief? What power does it protect? What actions does it justify? These questions are not attacks. They are not hate. They are simply the application of reason to claims that demand to be accepted without question. And in a world where nationalism is rising, where leaders claim to speak for God or for the true people, where groups are told they are special and others are told they are less, Spinoza's lesson has never been more urgent. So in this video, I am going to show you exactly what Spinoza discovered. I am going to walk you through his logic, show you the evidence he found in the biblical texts themselves, and explain how the concept of being chosen actually worked as a political tool. I am going to show you why religious authorities were so terrified of his ideas that they tried to erase him from history. And I am going to show you why, despite 2 centuries of being called the most dangerous man in Europe, his ideas eventually won. Not because he was trying to destroy faith, but because he was brave enough to ask whether faith could survive honest questions. The answer to the title of this video, was Judaism actually chosen by God, is no. And Spinoza proved it without filters, without compromise, and without fear. What he paid for that truth, and what that truth means for all of us today, is a story that will change the way you see religion, power, and the human need to believe we are special. Let us begin with the man who dared to ask the question no one else would. Now let me answer the question directly, without making you wait. Was Judaism actually chosen by God? According to Baruch Spinoza, the answer is no. And before you close this video, before you think this is just another attack on religion, let me tell you what Spinoza actually discovered. Because what he found was not that Judaism was a lie, or that Jewish people were deceived by evil leaders. What he found was something far more interesting, far more human, and in many ways far more remarkable. Spinoza discovered that the concept of being chosen by God was not a cosmic truth handed down from heaven. It was a survival strategy. It was a brilliant, powerful, necessary invention created by a small community that was constantly under threat of destruction. Think about that for a moment. The Jewish people were surrounded by massive empires. Egypt to the south, Babylon to the east, Assyria to the north, Persia, Greece, Rome. One after another, these superpowers dominated the ancient world. And in the middle of all that power, there was this tiny group of people with no great army, no vast territory, no military strength to speak of. How do you survive in a world like that? How do you keep your identity when everyone around you is trying to absorb you, convert you? The answer, according to Spinoza, was genius. You create an identity so strong, so absolute, so rooted in the divine that nothing can shake it. You tell your people that they are not just another tribe among many. You tell them that the creator of the universe himself has chosen them for a special purpose. You tell them that their laws are not human customs but divine commands. You tell them that their survival is not just about politics or military strategy, but about fulfilling God's plan for all of history. And when you do that, you create something that cannot be conquered by armies. You create an identity that survives even when the temple is destroyed, even when the land is lost, even when the people are scattered across the world. That is what Spinoza saw when he looked at the concept of being chosen. He did not see a lie. He saw one of the most effective survival mechanisms in human history. But Spinoza did not stop there. He asked the deeper question. If this concept was so effective, if it helped the Jewish people survive for thousands of years, does that make it true? Does effectiveness equal truth? Can something be powerful and necessary and still not be literally accurate? And this is where Spinoza became dangerous, because he said yes. He said that the concept of being chosen served a crucial purpose, but that purpose was human, not divine. It was about community cohesion, about maintaining boundaries, about giving people a reason to follow difficult laws and maintain their distinct identity, even under persecution. It was brilliant strategy, not cosmic fact. Now, Spinoza did not just make this claim and walk away. He was a philosopher, and philosophers need evidence. So he provided 3 major proofs for his argument. 3 separate lines of reasoning that, when taken together, made his case almost impossible to refute. That is why his ideas were so dangerous. That is why they could not just be dismissed as the ramblings of an angry heretic. His logic was too tight, his evidence was too strong, his arguments were too carefully constructed. The first proof was philosophical. Spinoza argued that an infinite universal God cannot logically choose one group of people over all others. Think about what it means to say God is infinite. It means God is everywhere, in everything, beyond time and space, without limits or boundaries. An infinite God does not have preferences the way humans do. An infinite God does not look down and say, I like this group better than that group. That would make God finite, limited, bound by human-like emotions and choices. Spinoza said that when we claim God chose Israel, we are not describing God. We are projecting human thinking onto God. We are imagining God as a king who picks favorites, when the very nature of infinity means God cannot have favorites. If God is truly the God of all creation, then God must be equally present in all people, all nations, all of humanity. The moment you say God chose one over another, you have made God smaller. You have made God human. The second proof was textual. Spinoza went through the Torah, the 5 books that Judaism claims were written by Moses and dictated by God himself. And he found problems, big problems. He found contradictions that should not exist if one divine author wrote the entire text. He found verses that describe events that happened after Moses died. He found references to places that did not exist until centuries after Moses lived. He found different writing styles, different names for God, different theological perspectives, all mixed together in the same books. And he concluded that the Torah was not written by one person at one time. It was compiled and edited over many centuries by many different human authors. That does not make it worthless. It does not make it unimportant. But it does mean it is a human document, not a divine dictation. And if it is a human document, then the claims it makes, including the claim that God chose Israel, must be understood as human claims, not divine facts. The third proof was historical. Spinoza looked at when the concept of being chosen became most important to Jewish identity, and he noticed a pattern. The emphasis on being chosen grew strongest during times of crisis. When the Jewish people were exiled to Babylon and their temple was destroyed, the concept of being chosen became central to their identity. When they were under Greek rule and facing pressure to abandon their customs, the concept intensified. When the Romans destroyed the Second Temple and scattered the Jews across the empire, being chosen became everything, because it was the one thing that could not be taken away by force. Spinoza saw this pattern and understood it. The concept of being chosen was not constant and unchanging from the beginning of time. It evolved. It grew stronger when it was needed most. And that evolution, Spinoza argued, showed that it was a human response to human circumstances, not an eternal divine decree. These three proofs, philosophical, textual, and historical, formed the foundation of Spinoza's argument. And what makes them so powerful is that they do not rely on mockery or anger or hatred. They rely on logic, on evidence, on careful reading of the texts themselves. Spinoza loved the Jewish tradition. He knew it deeply. He respected its wisdom and its survival. But he refused to confuse respect with blind acceptance. He insisted that true respect for any tradition means being willing to examine it honestly, to ask hard questions, to follow the evidence even when it challenges what you have always believed. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. If Spinoza was right, if being chosen is not literally true, does that mean Judaism has no value? Does that mean Jewish history is meaningless? Does that mean all those centuries of faith and sacrifice were based on nothing? And the answer Spinoza would give is absolutely not. Think about it this way. If I tell you that a particular painting is not literally a window, does that make the painting worthless? If I tell you that a beautiful story is not historically accurate in every detail, does that mean the story has no power? Spinoza argued that the concept of being chosen, even if not literally true, accomplished something extraordinary. It kept a people alive across 2,000 years without a homeland. It preserved a moral and intellectual tradition that contributed immensely to human civilization. It created resilience in the face of persecution that should have destroyed any normal community 100 times over. The fact that it was a human creation, not a divine gift, does not diminish those achievements. In some ways, it makes them more impressive. But here is the catch, and this is why religious authorities feared Spinoza so much. If you admit that being chosen is a human concept, not a divine one, then you also have to admit that it can be questioned, it can be examined, it can even be changed if necessary, and that threatens the power of anyone who claims to speak for God, anyone who says you must obey because this is what God commanded for his chosen people. Spinoza was not just questioning a belief, he was questioning the entire structure of religious authority. But he was saying that no claim should be accepted without evidence, no matter how sacred, no matter how old, no matter how many people believe it. And that idea, more than anything else, is what made him dangerous. So there you have it. The direct answer to the question in the title, no. According to Spinoza, Judaism was not chosen by God in the literal sense. But what it was instead, a survival strategy, a community-building narrative, a source of resilience, is in many ways more interesting and more worthy of respect than a simple claim of divine favoritism. Now, in the sections that follow, I'm going to take you through each of those three proofs in detail. I'm going to show you exactly what Spinoza found in the texts, exactly how the historical evidence supports his view, and exactly why his logic about the nature of God was so difficult to refute. But before we get there, you need to understand who this man was, what he risked to speak these truths, and why the world tried so hard to silence him. Because the story of Spinoza is not just about ideas, it is about courage. It is about the price of thinking freely, and it is about what happens when one person decides that truth matters more than safety. To understand why Spinoza's ideas were so dangerous, you first need to understand the world he came from. Amsterdam in the mid-1600s was one of the most tolerant cities in Europe, but that tolerance was relative. It was a place where you could think freely, as long as you did not speak too freely. It was a place where different religions could coexist as long as they stayed within their boundaries, and it was in this fragile balance that Baruch Spinoza was born in 1632 into a Portuguese Jewish family that had fled the terrors of the Spanish Inquisition. His family was part of a community that knew persecution intimately. These were Jews who had been forced to convert to Christianity in Spain and Portugal, who had practiced their faith in secret, who had risked torture and death just to observe the Sabbath or refuse to eat pork. When they finally escaped to Amsterdam, they brought with them a fierce determination to preserve their Jewish identity, to never again compromise their beliefs, to never again bow to pressure from the outside world. This was the community that raised Spinoza. This was the environment that shaped his early years, and this would be the community that would ultimately try to destroy him. Young Baruch was brilliant. Everyone could see it. He studied at the Jewish school in Amsterdam, learning Hebrew, studying the Torah, the Talmud, the commentaries of the great rabbis. He was groomed to become a scholar, possibly even a rabbi himself. His teachers had high hopes for him, but Spinoza had a quality that made him dangerous. He asked questions. Not just any questions, but the kind of questions that make people uncomfortable, the kind of questions that challenge foundations, the kind of questions that, once asked, cannot be unasked. He began noticing things in the sacred text that did not make sense. He would read a passage and think, wait, this contradicts what was said 3 chapters earlier. He would study the stories and wonder, how could Moses have written about his own death and burial? He would examine the laws and ask, why would an infinite God care whether we mix wool and linen in our clothing? These were not questions of rebellion. They were questions of genuine curiosity. But in a community that had suffered so much for its faith, curiosity about the foundations of that faith felt like betrayal. As Spinoza grew older, his questions grew bolder. He began studying philosophy, reading the works of Descartes and other thinkers who were applying reason to questions that had always been answered by faith alone. He started suggesting in conversations that maybe the Bible was not dictated word for word by God. Maybe it was written by humans, inspired by their understanding of the divine, but still ultimately a human product. Maybe angels were not actual beings but symbolic representations. Maybe when the text says God has a hand or a face, it is speaking metaphorically, not literally, because an infinite God cannot have a physical body. For the leaders of the Jewish community, these ideas were not just wrong, they were catastrophic. This was a community that had defined itself by absolute adherence to the Torah as the literal word of God. This was a community that had watched family members burned alive for refusing to compromise on matters of faith. And now, here was one of their own, a young man they had educated and nurtured, suggesting that the very foundation of their identity might be open to interpretation. It was unthinkable, it was unforgivable, and it had to be stopped. In July of 1656, when Spinoza was just 23 years old, the leaders of the Amsterdam Jewish community gathered to pronounce judgment on him. What they issued was not a simple excommunication, it was a cherem, the most severe form of ban in Jewish law, and the language they used was unlike anything that had been pronounced before or since. They cursed him by day and by night. They cursed him when he lay down and when he rose up. They cursed him when he went out and when he came in. They declared that no one should communicate with him, that no one should show him any favor, that no one should stay under the same roof with him, that no one should come within 4 cubits of him, and that no one should read anything he wrote. The document went on to invoke the curses that fell upon Jericho, the leprosy of Naaman, and the punishments of Korah, who was swallowed by the earth. It was a curse so complete, so absolute, that it essentially declared Spinoza dead to the Jewish community. His own family was forbidden to speak to him. Friends he had grown up with had to cross the street to avoid him. Merchants could not sell to him. He became a ghost, a non-person, erased from the only community he had ever known. He was 23 years old. But what exactly were his crimes? The cherem itself does not list specific offenses. It speaks vaguely of abominable heresies and monstrous deeds. But from other sources, from testimonies and records, we know what Spinoza had been saying. He had argued that the soul might not be immortal in the way traditionally taught. He had questioned whether Moses really wrote the entire Torah. He had suggested that God does not have human-like emotions or physical form. He had wondered aloud whether angels might be symbolic rather than real beings. These were his heresies, these were the abominable acts, questions, doubts, the application of reason to matters of faith. Now, Here is what makes Spinoza extraordinary. After the excommunication, he could have recanted. He could have apologized, begged for forgiveness, promised to never question again. The community would likely have taken him back. His life could have returned to normal. He could have had his family, his friends, his place in society. But Spinoza did something else. He left. He walked away from the Jewish community, not in anger but in conviction. He chose exile over compromise. He chose loneliness over lying about what he believed. He chose intellectual freedom over social belonging. But the story does not end with excommunication, because some people in the community wanted to make sure Spinoza understood that banishment was not enough. One evening, as he was leaving the synagogue after attempting to pray there despite the ban, a man approached him. Historical records are unclear about who this person was, but what happened next is clear. The man pulled out a knife and lunged at Spinoza, aiming for his heart. Spinoza saw the blade coming and leapt aside at the last possible moment. The knife ripped through his cloak, grazing his skin but missing his vital organs. If he had moved a second later, Baruch Spinoza would have died at age 23, and the ideas that would shake Western philosophy would have died with him. The attacker disappeared into the night. Spinoza survived, and he did something remarkable with the torn cloak. He kept it. For the rest of his life, he kept that cloak with the knife hole in it, hanging it where he could see it every day. It was a reminder that the pursuit of truth can cost you everything. A reminder that asking questions can get you killed. A reminder that he had chosen this path knowing the dangers and that he would not turn back no matter what. After the excommunication and the assassination attempt, Spinoza had to rebuild his life from nothing. He could not work in the family business. He could not rely on the Jewish community for support. He needed a trade, something he could do with his hands that would give him independence. So he learned to grind lenses. This was not just any craft. The 17th century was a time of revolution in science. Telescopes were revealing the moons of Jupiter. Microscopes were showing that a drop of water contained entire worlds of tiny creatures. And all of these instruments needed precision lenses. Spinoza became known as one of the finest lens grinders in Europe. Scientists and scholars would seek out his work because his lenses were nearly perfect. There is something poetic about Spinoza grinding lenses. He was creating tools that allowed people to see things more clearly, to examine the very large and the very small with precision, and at the same time, he was using his mind as a lens to examine ideas more clearly, to look at the Bible and see its human construction, to look at the concept of God and see beyond the anthropomorphic projections. He was grinding away the distortions, trying to achieve perfect clarity in thought, just as he did in glass. But this work came at a cost. The process of grinding lenses created incredibly fine glass dust that floated in the air of his workshop. Day after day, year after year, Spinoza breathed in this dust. It accumulated in his lungs. It damaged his respiratory system. The very work that gave him independence was slowly killing him, and he knew it. But he had no choice. This was how he survived. This was how he maintained the freedom to think and write without depending on anyone who might try to control his ideas. Living alone, cut off from his birth community, working at a trade that was destroying his health, Spinoza could have become bitter. He could have spent his energy on revenge, on anger, on trying to hurt those who had hurt him. But that is not what he did. Instead, he studied, he wrote. He developed friendships with a small circle of free thinkers who met to discuss philosophy. He corresponded with the greatest minds of Europe, and slowly, carefully, he began to write down the ideas that had gotten him expelled. He began to construct a philosophical system that would explain not just the problem with the concept of being chosen, but the entire relationship between God, nature, humanity, and freedom. He wrote in Latin, the language of scholars, because he wanted his ideas to reach an educated audience across Europe. He wrote carefully, precisely, knowing that every word would be scrutinized, attacked, twisted by those who wanted to discredit him. He wrote knowing that publication would bring more danger, more condemnation, possibly even arrest. But he wrote anyway, because he believed something that overrode all fear. He believed that truth matters. He believed that humans have not just the right but the duty to use reason, to question authority, to examine claims, no matter how sacred. He believed that a faith that cannot withstand questions is not worth having. And he believed that freedom of thought is so fundamental to human dignity that no price is too high to preserve it. This was the man who would take on the concept of divine election. Not an angry rebel, not an ignorant outsider, not someone who hated Judaism or wanted to destroy it, but a brilliant scholar who knew the tradition inside and out, who had paid an extraordinary price for his questions, and who had the courage to follow logic wherever it led. In 1670, his most controversial work would appear in print, published anonymously because to attach his name to it would have been suicide. That book would become one of the most banned, most burned, most condemned works in European history, and it would lay out with devastating precision the three proofs I mentioned earlier. The proof that God cannot logically choose favorites, the proof that the Bible was written by humans over many centuries, and the proof that the concept of being chosen emerged during specific historical crises as a survival mechanism. But before we examine those proofs in detail, you need to understand one more thing about Spinoza. He did not write to win arguments. He did not write to make people angry or to shock them. He wrote because he believed that understanding the truth about how religious ideas developed would actually make those ideas more meaningful, not less. He believed that once we stop claiming divine authority for human constructions, we can have honest conversations about what we truly value, about what truly helps us live better lives, about what truly brings human beings together rather than dividing them. That vision, more than any specific claim about the Bible or about being chosen, is what made Spinoza one of the most important thinkers in Western history. And it is that vision we will explore as we dive into his arguments. The man who kept a torn cloak as a reminder that truth is dangerous. The man who chose poverty and loneliness over intellectual compromise. The man who asked the question no one was supposed to ask, and then had the courage to answer it. In 1670, 14 years after his excommunication, Spinoza completed the work that would make him the most feared thinker in Europe. He published it anonymously, under a false publisher's name, in a city far from Amsterdam. The title was long and academic, designed to sound like just another scholarly treatise, Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, a theological political treatise. But beneath that dry title was intellectual dynamite. This was not a book that whispered doubts. This was a book that demolished foundations. And Spinoza knew exactly what he was doing. The book's central argument was deceptively simple. Religious texts, including the Bible, must be read and analyzed like any other historical document. They should be examined with reason, compared against historical evidence, and understood in the context of when and why they were written. This might sound obvious to us today, but in 1670 it was revolutionary. It was saying that the Bible does not get special protection from critical examination just because people call it holy. It was saying that claiming something is divinely inspired does not make it immune to questions about authorship, contradictions, or historical accuracy. Spinoza applied this method specifically to the concept of Israel being chosen by God. He argued that this belief emerged not from divine revelation, but from human needs during specific historical moments. He showed how the idea served political purposes, how it created group cohesion, how it justified laws and maintained boundaries. He demonstrated that the concept evolved over time, becoming more prominent during crises, when the Jewish community needed something unshakable to hold on to. And most dangerously, he concluded that calling something divinely ordained, when it is actually humanly constructed, gives tremendous power to those who claim to interpret God's will. But Spinoza did not stop with Judaism. He extended his analysis to Christianity as well, showing how the Church had used similar claims of divine authority to maintain political power. He argued that religious institutions across history had taken the teachings of wise and compassionate figures like Moses or Jesus and transformed them into systems of control. He claimed that true religion, the kind that actually matters, is not about rituals or claims of being specially chosen. True religion is about justice, compassion, and loving your neighbor. Everything else, all the ceremonies and exclusive claims and demands for unquestioning obedience, that is politics dressed up as piety. The reaction was instant and violent. Within months, the Tractatus was condemned by the Catholic Church and placed on the index of forbidden books. Protestant leaders across Europe denounced it as the work of the devil. Jewish rabbis who had already expelled Spinoza now doubled down, warning their communities that this book was spiritual poison. The states of Holland, normally tolerant, banned the book. It was illegal to own it, illegal to sell it, illegal to read it. Copies were publicly burned in town squares. Anyone caught with it could face prosecution. But here is the fascinating part. Despite all the bans, despite all the burnings, despite all the condemnations, the book spread like wildfire. It was printed secretly in different cities under different titles. It was smuggled across borders. It was copied by hand when printed versions could not be found. Educated people across Europe, even those who publicly condemned it, secretly read it. Why? Because the arguments were too strong to ignore. Even people who hated what Spinoza was saying could not easily refute it. His logic was too tight, his knowledge of the texts was too deep, his evidence was too carefully presented. The authorities understood perfectly well what was at stake. If Spinoza was right, if the Bible was a human document that could be analyzed and questioned, then the entire structure of religious authority crumbled. Priests and rabbis and pastors could no longer say, "You must obey because God commands it." Kings could no longer claim divine right to rule. Churches could no longer threaten eternal damnation for questioning their teachings. The whole system of power that had dominated Europe for over 1,000 years rested on the foundation that certain texts and certain institutions spoke with the voice of God. Spinoza was taking a hammer to that foundation. What made the book even more dangerous was its style. Spinoza did not write like an angry revolutionary. He did not mock or insult. He wrote calmly, logically, methodically. He anticipated objections and addressed them. He quoted extensively from the Bible itself to support his arguments. He showed, not just claimed, that the texts contained contradictions and anachronisms. He demonstrated, with specific examples, how the concept of being chosen had evolved over time. It was impossible to dismiss him as ignorant or emotional. He knew the material better than most of his critics. He argued more carefully than they did, and that made him terrifying. One particularly devastating section of the Tractatus examined the claim that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. Spinoza pointed out that these books describe events after Moses' death. They refer to Moses in the third person, as if talking about someone from long ago. They mention places by names that did not exist until centuries after Moses supposedly lived. They contain different writing styles and different names for God mixed together. Spinoza concluded that the Pentateuch, the Torah, was compiled from multiple sources over many centuries and then attributed to Moses to give it authority. This was not just questioning a detail. This was questioning the fundamental claim that the Torah was divinely dictated to one person at one time. Another section examined miracles. Spinoza argued that what people call miracles are not violations of natural law, but events we do not yet understand. He said that natural law, the way the universe actually works, cannot be violated because natural law is an expression of God's nature. If God is infinite and unchanging, then the laws of nature must also be unchanging. What looks like a miracle is either a rare natural event, a misunderstanding, or an exaggeration added to a story over time. This removed one of the main pillars supporting religious authority, the claim that certain people or groups had special access to supernatural power. Perhaps most radical was Spinoza's argument about freedom of thought. He claimed that no government, no church, no authority of any kind has the right to control what people think or say about religion. He argued that attempting to enforce religious uniformity always leads to hypocrisy, where people pretend to believe what they must while thinking something else privately. He said that true faith cannot be commanded or enforced. It must be freely chosen, and a society that allows freedom of thought and speech is stronger, not weaker, than one that demands conformity. This was not just philosophy, this was a political manifesto, and the authorities knew it. They called Spinoza an atheist, though he was not. They called him an enemy of religion, though he claimed to be defending true religion against its corruption. They said he wanted to destroy morality, though he argued for justice and compassion more strongly than many religious leaders. But what he really was, and what they really feared, was a man who refused to accept that any belief, no matter how old or widely held, should be protected from honest examination. The Tractatus Theologico-Politicus did not convince everyone. Many who read it were horrified, many rejected its arguments completely. But it planted seeds. It showed that the unquestionable could be questioned. It demonstrated that careful reasoning could challenge even the most sacred beliefs. It proved that one person, armed with nothing but logic and evidence, could take on the combined authority of church and synagogue and state. And though Spinoza would die young, poor, and still condemned by religious authorities, his book would outlive them all. It would inspire the Enlightenment thinkers who came after him. It would lay the groundwork for modern biblical scholarship. It would influence the development of religious freedom in democratic societies. And it would force anyone who reads it, even today, to confront the uncomfortable question at its heart: how much of what we call divine truth is actually human construction? And if we cannot answer that question honestly, what does that say about the strength of our beliefs? The forbidden book had been released. The ideas it contained could not be put back in the bottle. And now, centuries later, we can examine those ideas without fear of being burned at the stake. We can look at Spinoza's three proofs: the philosophical argument, the textual evidence, and the historical analysis, and judge for ourselves whether they hold up. That is what we will do in the sections ahead. We will dive deep into each proof, examine the evidence Spinoza presented, and see whether his controversial conclusion about Judaism being chosen by God can withstand scrutiny. Spoiler alert: after 350 years of attack, criticism, and counterargument, his logic remains remarkably difficult to refute. Let us see why. Now we come to the heart of Spinoza's argument, the first of his three proofs that Judaism was not chosen by God. And this proof is entirely philosophical. It does not require you to know Hebrew. It does not require you to study ancient history. It requires only that you think clearly about what we mean when we say God is infinite. So let us think clearly together. When religious people talk about God, they use certain words over and over: infinite, eternal, omnipresent, all-powerful, all-knowing. These are not just flowery descriptions, they are attempts to describe the fundamental nature of what God is supposed to be. God is not just a very powerful being among other beings. God is not just a very wise king among other kings. God is supposed to be something categorically different from everything else that exists. God is supposed to be the source of all existence, the ground of all being, the one thing that is not created but creates everything else. This is what theologians mean when they call God infinite. Now here is Spinoza's question. If God is truly infinite, truly everywhere, truly the source of all that exists, then how can God possibly choose one group of people over all others? Think about what choosing means. When you or I choose something, we are expressing a preference. We are saying, I like this more than that. I want this instead of that. But preference implies limitation. It implies that there are things we value more and things we value less. It implies that we are affected by particular qualities that some things have and others do not. When I choose chocolate ice cream over vanilla, I am revealing something about my particular tastes, my particular psychology, my particular nature as a limited being with specific preferences. But God, if infinite, cannot be limited in this way. An infinite being does not have particular tastes or preferences in the human sense, because an infinite being is equally present in all things, equally the source of all things, equally sustaining all things. Does the sun choose to shine on one garden more than another? Does the ocean choose to be wetter for some fish than others? These questions sound absurd because the sun and ocean are, in their own ways, universal in their effects. And God, if truly infinite, must be even more universal than these. God cannot be more present in Jerusalem than in Mecca, more attentive to Jews than to Egyptians, more concerned with Israel than with any other nation. To say otherwise is to make God finite. It is to turn God into a tribal deity, a cosmic king with favorites, a being with limitations and preferences and boundaries. It is to make God smaller. Spinoza pressed this point with relentless logic. If God is the creator of all humans, then God must be equally the creator of every human. If God is the sustainer of all life, then God must equally sustain Jewish life and Egyptian life and every other life. If God's wisdom and power are infinite, then they cannot be directed more toward one people than another, any more than mathematics can be more true for one culture than another. The laws of nature do not apply differently in Israel than they do in Babylon. The sun does not shine differently on chosen people than on unchosen people. And if God is truly the God of nature, the God of the universe, the God of all existence, then God cannot possibly play favorites. Now, let us look at what the Bible actually says and see if it matches this philosophical understanding of God. Turn to Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6. Here is what it says: "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possession." This is one of the clearest statements of the chosen people concept in the entire Bible, and it is repeated with variations many times throughout the Hebrew scriptures. You are special. You are selected. You are treasured above all others. God has chosen you. Read those words carefully. They do not describe an infinite God. They describe a God with preferences, a God who looks at all the nations of the earth and decides, "I like this one best." A God who has treasured possessions, which implies that other things are less treasured. A God who chooses one people, which means he does not choose others. This is the language of kingship, not infinity. This is how a human ruler talks about his favorite subjects, not how an infinite creator relates to all of creation. Spinoza saw this contradiction clearly. Either God is infinite, universal, and equally present in all things, or God is finite, particular, and preferential toward certain groups. You cannot have both. You cannot say God is infinite and then immediately say God chose one nation out of all nations. That is like saying this circle is perfectly round and also square. The two claims contradict each other. And when you find a contradiction like this, something has to give. Either we revise our understanding of what God is, or we revise our interpretation of what this verse means. The traditional interpretation insists that both things are somehow true. God is infinite and universal, but also specifically chose Israel. When pressed on how this works, traditional theology offers various explanations. Maybe God chose Israel not because they are better, but to give them more responsibility. Maybe being chosen means having more obligations, not more privileges. Maybe it is a mystery we cannot understand, and we just have to accept both things on faith. But Spinoza rejected all of these attempts to have it both ways. He said, these are not solutions, they are evasions. They are ways of avoiding the logical problem rather than resolving it. If God chose Israel for a special purpose, why that purpose? Why not choose Egypt or Babylon or China for that purpose? If the answer is that Israel was more receptive, more moral, more ready to receive God's message, then the choice was not really God's. It was Israel's qualities that determined the outcome, which means Israel chose itself, not that God chose Israel. If the answer is that it is a mystery beyond human understanding, then we have abandoned logic entirely and admitted that the claim makes no rational sense. And if the answer is that being chosen means more responsibility, not superiority, then why does the text itself keep using language of being treasured, special, set apart, holy above others? The text does not read like a burden, it reads like a privilege. Spinoza went further. He pointed out that this language of being chosen appears most strongly in texts written during and after the Babylonian exile, when the Jewish community was under enormous pressure, when their temple was destroyed, when they were scattered and threatened with absorption into other cultures. In earlier texts, before the great crises, the emphasis is different. God is described more as the God of Israel in a matter-of-fact way, the way each nation had its patron deity. But later, after crisis and exile, the language becomes much more emphatic. You are the chosen ones. You are special above all others. God loves you more than any other nation. This is not the language of eternal cosmic truth. This is the language of a community desperately trying to maintain its identity against overwhelming odds. Think about it from a human perspective. If you are a small community surrounded by powerful empires, if your temple has been destroyed and your people scattered, if everything physical that defined your identity is gone, what do you have left? You have your beliefs. You have your sense of who you are. And to keep that identity from dissolving, you need something unshakable. You need a belief so strong that no empire can destroy it, so absolute that no persecution can diminish it. What better belief than this? We are chosen by God Himself, not chosen by accident or by our own merit, but chosen by the Creator of the universe for His own purposes. This gives you a reason to stay distinct, to not assimilate, to maintain your laws and customs, even when it would be easier to blend in. It gives meaning to suffering. We are being tested because we are special. It transforms victimhood into sacred purpose. Spinoza recognized the genius of this. He did not mock it. He did not call it stupid or primitive. He called it brilliant. It worked. It kept the Jewish people alive as a distinct community for over 2,000 years, without a homeland, something almost no other ancient people managed to accomplish. But brilliant and effective does not mean literally true in a cosmic sense. A powerful story that serves crucial purposes can still be a human creation rather than a divine revelation. Here is an analogy. Imagine a family that has lost everything in a disaster. Their home is gone, their possessions are gone, their sense of security is shattered. And the parents tell the children, "We are special. We come from a long line of survivors. Our ancestors overcame worse than this. We have something in our blood, in our spirit, that cannot be destroyed." Is this literally biologically true? Probably not. But is it effective? Does it give the children strength and resilience? Does it help the family rebuild? Yes, absolutely. And would you criticize those parents for giving their children that belief? Probably not. You would recognize it as a necessary fiction, a powerful story that serves the crucial purpose of survival. Spinoza argued that this is what the concept of being chosen was for the Jewish community. It was not a lie in the sense of intentional deception. It was a necessary belief, a powerful narrative that emerged during crisis and served the essential purpose of maintaining group identity and cohesion. The leaders who promoted this belief were not con artists. They were doing what leaders do, finding ways to keep their people together, to give them strength, to preserve their community against existential threats. But the fact that it worked, the fact that it was necessary, the fact that it was brilliant, does not make it a literal description of how an infinite God actually relates to humanity. So, what does this mean for how we understand God? Spinoza offered an alternative. Instead of imagining God as a cosmic king who chooses favorites, imagine God as the infinite substance that is equally present in all things, not a God who prefers Jews to Gentiles, but a God whose nature is expressed in the laws of mathematics, in the patterns of nature, in the capacity for reason that all humans share. Not a God who intervenes in history to favor one group, but a God whose presence is the very ground of existence itself, available to anyone, anywhere, who seeks truth with honesty and reason. This is not atheism. Spinoza believed deeply in God, but his God was not the God of traditional religion. His God did not give special revelations to special people. His God did not choose one nation above others. His God was not moved by prayers or pleased by rituals. His God was the infinite, eternal, unchanging reality that underlies all of existence. And this God, precisely because infinite and unchanging, could not possibly play favorites among the finite beings whose existence flows from the divine nature. The logical proof stands on its own. You do not have to accept Spinoza's alternative vision of God to recognize the power of his argument. The simple question remains, how can an infinite God choose one group over all others without ceasing to be infinite? Traditional theology has never answered this question satisfactorily. It has only insisted that both things are somehow mysteriously true. But insisting on a mystery is not the same as resolving a contradiction. And Spinoza's logic remains, after 3.5 centuries, one of the most powerful challenges to the concept of any group being divinely chosen above all others. This was his first proof, a proof built entirely on logical reasoning about what it means for God to be infinite. But Spinoza did not stop here. He had 2 more proofs, each from a different angle. The second proof comes from the biblical texts themselves, from what they reveal when read carefully and critically. And the third proof comes from history, from understanding when and why the concept of being chosen emerged and intensified. Together, these 3 proofs form an argument that has challenged religious thinking for over 3 centuries and remains as powerful today as when Spinoza first presented it in his forbidden book. Let us now turn to the textual evidence and see what the Bible itself reveals when we dare to read it with the same careful attention we would give to any other ancient document. The philosophical argument is powerful, but Spinoza knew that philosophy alone would not be enough. People could say, yes, your logic is interesting, but God works in mysterious ways that transcend human logic. So Spinoza turned to the texts themselves. He said, let us look at what the Bible actually contains. Let us read it carefully, honestly, the way we would read any ancient document. And when we do, what do we find? We find evidence, clear and undeniable, that these texts were written by human beings over many centuries, not dictated by God to one person at one time. And if the texts are human, then the claims they make, including the claim that God chose Israel, must be understood as human claims, not divine facts. Let us start with the most obvious problem, one so clear that it is shocking more people do not talk about it. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, is traditionally attributed to Moses. Jews and Christians have believed for thousands of years that Moses wrote these books, that God dictated them to Moses on Mount Sinai or during the 40 years in the wilderness. But here is the problem. The last chapter of Deuteronomy, the last book supposedly written by Moses, describes Moses' death and burial. It says, "And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor. But to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak nor his strength gone." Read that again. Moses died, He was buried. No one knows where his grave is to this day. His eyes were not weak. These are not the words of Moses describing his own death in advance. These are the words of someone writing long after Moses died, looking back on Moses as a historical figure, explaining that even in the time of the writer, no one knew where Moses was buried. The phrase "to this day" only makes sense if significant time has passed since the event, and the description of Moses in the third person as someone whose life is complete and can be evaluated is clearly not something Moses wrote about himself. Spinoza pointed this out and asked the obvious question: if Moses did not write the end of Deuteronomy, who did? And if someone else wrote the end, might they have written other parts as well? This was not a new observation. Jewish scholars, centuries before Spinoza, had noticed this problem. But they explained it away by saying that Joshua, Moses' successor, added the final chapter after Moses died. Fine, Spinoza said, but that already admits that not all of the Torah was written by Moses. It admits human authorship. And once you admit that, you have to ask, how much else might be human rather than divine? And this is just the beginning. The Torah is filled with verses that make no sense if Moses wrote them. In Genesis, it says, "The Canaanites were then in the land." The word "then" implies that when this was written, the Canaanites were no longer in the land. But the Canaanites were still in the land during Moses' time. They only disappeared much later, after the Israelites had conquered and settled Canaan. So this verse must have been written long after Moses, by someone looking back on a time when Canaanites lived in a land where they no longer existed. In Deuteronomy it says, "No prophet has risen in Israel like Moses." This is clearly a statement made by someone evaluating Moses in comparison to other prophets who came after him. Moses could not have written this about himself. Someone later, looking back over the history of prophecy in Israel, wrote this evaluation. There are dozens of examples like this. Place names that did not exist in Moses' time. References to kings of Israel when there were no kings. Yet statements that only make sense if written centuries after the events they describe. And all of this points to one conclusion. The Torah was not written by one person at one time. It was compiled and edited over centuries by multiple authors who wove together older traditions, added explanatory notes, and shaped the material to serve the needs of their own time. Spinoza went deeper. He noticed that the Torah uses different names for God in different sections. Sometimes it is Elohim, sometimes it is Yahweh translated as the Lord. Sometimes it switches back and forth, even within the same chapter. Why would God dictate his own name differently in different sections? Why would Moses record God's name inconsistently? The traditional answer is that the different names reflect different attributes of God. Elohim represents God's justice. Yahweh represents God's mercy. But Spinoza pointed out that this explanation does not work. The names do not consistently correlate with themes of justice or mercy. Instead, they seem to indicate different source documents that were later combined. Modern biblical scholarship has confirmed Spinoza's intuition. Scholars now identify at least 4 major source documents that were woven together to create the Torah. They call them J, E, D, and P. The J source uses Yahweh for God's name. The E source uses Elohim. The D source is mostly Deuteronomy, written in a distinctive style. The P source is the priestly material focused on laws and rituals. Each source has its own vocabulary, its own style, its own theological perspective, and when you separate them out, you can see how the editors combined them, sometimes creating contradictions or duplicate stories in the process. Take the creation story. The first chapter of Genesis describes creation in a specific order. God creates plants, then sea creatures and birds, then land animals, then humans, male and female together. But in chapter 2, the order changes. God creates a man first, then plants the Garden of Eden, then creates animals and brings them to the man to name, and only after that, seeing that the man is alone, creates woman from his rib. These are 2 different creation stories with two different orders of events, and two different understandings of how humans came to be. If God dictated both, why would God give two different accounts? But if these are two separate traditions from different communities, later combined by an editor who wanted to preserve both, then the contradiction makes sense. The same thing happens with the flood story. If you read Genesis carefully, you will notice that God tells Noah to take 2 of every animal in some verses, but 7 pairs of clean animals in other verses. The flood lasts 40 days in some verses, but 150 days in other verses. Noah sends out a raven in one verse and a dove in another. These are not just minor details. They are signs that 2 different flood traditions were combined together and the editor did not fully harmonize them. We end up with a text that contains both versions, creating a richer but more complex narrative than either version alone. Spinoza saw all of this, he documented it carefully, and he concluded that the Torah is not a single divine revelation, but a library of texts, written over many centuries by many different authors, reflecting different times, different circumstances, and different theological perspectives. This does not make the texts worthless. Ancient literature compiled from multiple sources can still be valuable, still be wise, still teach important lessons. But it does mean we cannot treat these texts as if God dictated every word to Moses in the wilderness. They are human documents, created by human communities, serving human purposes in specific historical contexts. And here is where it connects to the concept of being chosen. When you trace how the idea of Israel being chosen develops through the biblical texts, you see it is not constant. In the earliest texts, God is simply the God of Israel, the way other nations had their gods. The text does not emphasize that Israel is chosen above all others. It just tells stories of God helping Israel, the way Egyptian texts tell stories of their gods helping Egypt. But later, especially in texts written during and after the Babylonian exile, the language changes. Now it is not just that God helps Israel. It is that God chose Israel above all nations. God loves Israel more than anyone else. Israel is God's treasured possession. The emphasis on being uniquely chosen intensifies precisely when the community is under the greatest threat. Industry, Reba, Met, Elidi. Think about what this means. In the book of Exodus, when the Israelites are supposedly escaping from Egypt, the focus is on liberation, on becoming free from slavery. There is not much emphasis on being chosen above others. But in Deuteronomy, written much later, the rhetoric is much stronger. You are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord has chosen you out of all the peoples on earth. Why the difference? Because Deuteronomy was likely compiled during or after the exile, when the Jewish community desperately needed a reason to maintain their distinct identity. The earlier texts, from more secure times, did not need such emphatic language. The later texts, from crisis periods, amplified the concept of chosenness because it served an urgent purpose. The prophets tell a similar story. The earlier prophets, like Amos and Hosea, do not spend much time on the idea of Israel being chosen. They focus on justice, on caring for the poor, on criticizing the wealthy and powerful. But later prophets, especially during and after the exile, emphasize the special relationship between God and Israel much more strongly. Isaiah, writing during the exile, has God say, "You are my servant Israel, in whom I will display my splendor." This is language of special election, of being set apart for a unique purpose. And it appears most strongly when the community has lost everything else, when their identity is threatened, when they need something unshakable to cling to. Spinoza traced this evolution and saw it for what it was. The concept of being chosen was not revealed at Mount Sinai and then consistently maintained. It grew over time. It intensified during crises. It became central to identity precisely when that identity was most threatened. This is exactly what you would expect if the concept was a human response to historical circumstances. It is not what you would expect if it was an eternal truth dictated by God. But Spinoza did not stop with analyzing the text itself. He also looked at the external evidence. What do other ancient sources tell us about Israelite history? And here the picture becomes even more complicated. Egyptian records, which are extensive and detailed, make no mention of Hebrew slaves or a massive exodus. No pharaoh's diary records losing a huge labor force. No administrative documents note the economic impact. No historical chronicles describe plagues or a parted sea. The Egyptians were meticulous record keepers. They documented military defeats, natural disasters, economic problems, but they documented nothing that looks like the Exodus, as described in the Bible. Archaeological evidence is similarly problematic. The Bible describes the Israelites wandering in the desert for 40 years, a community of hundreds of thousands of people, but archaeologists have found no evidence of such a massive group in the Sinai desert. No campsites, no pottery, no burial sites, nothing that would indicate a large population moving through that region for 4 decades. Similarly, the conquest of Canaan described in Joshua does not match the archaeological record. Many of the cities said to have been destroyed showed no evidence of destruction in that time period. Some did not even exist yet. The archaeological picture suggests a gradual emergence of Israelite identity within Canaan, not a dramatic military conquest from outside. Does this mean the biblical accounts are entirely fiction? Not necessarily. There may well have been a historical kernel, a group that escaped from Egypt, a leader like Moses, a covenant at a mountain. But what we have in the Bible is not a straightforward historical record. It is a theological narrative shaped and reshaped over centuries to serve the religious and political needs of the community. It is the story the community told about itself, not a transcript of what actually happened. And recognizing this, recognizing that the text is shaped by human hands for human purposes, changes how we read the claims the text makes. When Deuteronomy says, God chose Israel above all peoples, we can now understand that this is a claim made by a community about itself, a claim that served the purpose of maintaining identity and cohesion, a claim that grew stronger over time as the need for it grew stronger. It is not a neutral report of what God said, it is a powerful, purposeful statement of self-understanding by a community fighting to survive. And that is a very different thing from a direct divine revelation. Spinoza's textual analysis was revolutionary. Before him, people read the Bible as a unified text from a single divine source. After him, it became possible to read the Bible historically, to see the layers of composition, to understand how different circumstances shaped different portions of the text. This approach, called historical critical method, is now standard in academic biblical studies. It is taught in liberal seminaries. It is accepted by Reform Judaism. Even many traditional scholars acknowledge that the texts have a complex history, even if they maintain that God somehow guided that history. But Spinoza went further than most modern scholars dare to go. He did not just say the texts have a complex history. He said this complexity reveals that the claim of being chosen is not a divine decree, but a human construction. He said that once you see how and when this claim emerged, once you understand what purposes it served, you can no longer treat it as an eternal cosmic truth. You have to recognize it as what it is, a powerful narrative created by a community to ensure its survival. Brilliant, necessary, effective, but still human. The evidence is overwhelming. The texts themselves contain contradictions, anachronisms, and signs of multiple authorship. The concept of chosenness evolves and intensifies over time in correlation with external threats. The external historical and archaeological record does not support the biblical narrative in its details. All of this points in one direction. The Torah is a human document, compiled over centuries, shaped by the needs and circumstances of the communities that created it. And the concept of Israel being chosen by God is not a fact revealed at Sinai, but a belief developed and strengthened over time, as the Jewish community struggled to maintain its identity against enormous pressures. This does not make the texts meaningless. It does not make the Jewish tradition worthless. It does not even mean there is no wisdom in the concept of chosenness. But it does mean we cannot point to these texts as proof that God actually chose one people above all others. The texts are evidence of human belief, human creativity, human resilience. They are testaments to how communities create meaning and maintain identity. They are extraordinary documents of religious and cultural development. But they are not, as Spinoza demonstrated with careful analysis, divine transcripts dictated word for word by an infinite God. This was his second proof, built not on philosophical logic, but on careful reading of the texts themselves. Combined with his first proof about the impossibility of an infinite God having favorites, the case becomes very strong. But Spinoza had one more proof, one more angle of approach. He wanted to show not just that the philosophical idea did not work and that the textual evidence did not support it, but also that we can understand exactly how and why the concept of chosenness emerged as a political strategy. That is where we turn next, to the historical circumstances that made the idea of being chosen not just believable, but necessary for survival, to the political genius that transformed a small, threatened community into one of the most resilient peoples in human history, to the third and final proof that Judaism was not chosen by God, but chose itself through one of the most brilliant survival strategies ever devised. Now we come to Spinoza's third and perhaps most illuminating proof. This one is not about philosophy or textual analysis, it is about history and politics. It asks a simple question. When exactly did the concept of being chosen become so central to Jewish identity, and what was happening at those moments that might explain why? When you look at the historical record, a clear pattern emerges. The idea of being divinely chosen intensified precisely when the Jewish community faced its greatest existential threats. And that pattern reveals something profound about what this belief actually was and what purpose it served. Let us set the scene. Imagine you are a small tribe living in the ancient Near East. To your south is Egypt, one of the most powerful empires the world has ever known, with massive armies, incredible wealth, and a civilization that has lasted thousands of years. To your north and east are Assyria and Babylon, military superpowers that conquer nations, destroy cities, and scatter populations. Later come the Persians, then the Greeks under Alexander, then the Romans, with their unstoppable legions. You are surrounded constantly by empires that could crush you without even trying very hard. You have no great army, you have no vast territory, you have no natural resources that make you powerful. You are, in every practical sense, insignificant on the world stage. So here is the question. How do you survive? How does a small, militarily weak community maintain its identity and coherence when surrounded by massive empires that could absorb or destroy you at any moment? Military power will not save you. You cannot build an army to match Egypt or Rome. Economic power will not save you. You cannot outtrade the Phoenicians or outproduce Babylon. So what can you do? You need something that armies cannot destroy, something that economic pressure cannot erase, something so powerful that it survives even when everything else is lost. You need an identity so strong, so absolute, so rooted in something beyond the physical world that nothing can take it away. This is where the genius comes in. You tell your people that they are not just another tribe trying to survive. You tell them that the creator of the universe himself has chosen them for a special purpose. You tell them that their laws are not human customs but divine commands that must be obeyed no matter what. You tell them that their identity is not a matter of geography or politics, but of cosmic significance. You tell them that they cannot become Egyptian or Babylonian or Greek because God himself has set them apart. And when you do this successfully, you create something that no empire can conquer. You create an identity that survives the destruction of the temple, the loss of the homeland, and 2,000 years of dispersion across the world. That is not just survival, that is one of the most extraordinary achievements in human history. Spinoza understood this completely. He saw that the concept of being chosen was not a random belief that happened to be true or false. It was a carefully constructed, brilliantly designed survival mechanism. It served multiple purposes simultaneously, each one reinforcing the others. First, it unified a people who had previously been divided into 12 separate tribes that often fought each other. By giving them all a shared identity as the chosen people of the one true God, it created cohesion where there had been fragmentation. Second, it provided absolute justification for maintaining distinct laws and customs. You cannot question why we do things differently if God Himself commanded it. Third, it created a clear boundary between us and them. We are chosen, they are not. We have a covenant with God, they do not. This makes assimilation not just undesirable, but theologically impossible. You cannot stop being chosen any more than you can unmake your own birth. Think about how this worked in practice. When the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and the Temple in 586 BCE and dragged much of the Jewish population into exile, everything that had defined Jewish identity seemed lost. The temple where God supposedly dwelt was rubble. The land God supposedly gave them was occupied by enemies. The kingdom God supposedly established was destroyed. By all normal measures, this should have been the end. The Jewish people should have done what every other conquered people did. They should have gradually adopted the language, religion, and customs of their conquerors. They should have become Babylonian. Within a few generations, there should have been no distinct Jewish identity left. But that is not what happened. And the reason it did not happen is because the community had something that could not be destroyed by armies or exile. They had the belief that they were chosen by God. Not chosen because of the temple was just a building. Not chosen because of the land was just geography. Chosen because God had made an eternal covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that could not be broken by human events. This meant that even in exile, even without a temple, even scattered across foreign lands, they were still the chosen people. Their identity did not depend on external circumstances. It was internal, unshakable, guaranteed by God Himself. This is why the language of chosenness became so emphatic during and after the Babylonian exile. The earlier texts, written when the kingdom was secure and the temple stood, did not need to emphasize chosenness so strongly. But the texts written during crisis, texts like Deuteronomy and parts of Isaiah, emphasized it constantly. You are chosen, you are special, you are set apart. God has not abandoned you. This exile is a test, a punishment for disobedience perhaps, but the covenant remains. You are still chosen. And if you maintain your identity, if you keep the laws, if you remain distinct from the nations around you, then eventually you will be restored. That message, repeated and reinforced, gave the exiled community a reason to maintain their distinct identity instead of dissolving into the surrounding culture. Now compare this to what happened to other ancient peoples in similar situations. When Assyria conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, they scattered the population across their empire. Those people, the 10 northern tribes, disappeared from history. They are sometimes called the lost tribes of Israel because they were absorbed into other populations and their distinct identity ceased to exist. When Babylon conquered various other nations around the same time they conquered Judah, those nations also disappeared. The Moabites, the Edomites, the Ammonites, all gone, absorbed, forgotten. But the Jews did not disappear. Why? Because they had something the others did not have. They had an identity tied to a belief that could not be destroyed by conquest or exile. They had the concept of being chosen. Spinoza traced this pattern through history. After the Babylonian exile, when some Jews returned to rebuild Jerusalem, the emphasis on maintaining distinct identity became even stronger. The books of Ezra and Nehemiah describe how the leaders forced Jewish men to divorce their foreign wives and send away their children because marriage with non-Jews threatened the purity of the chosen people. This was not ancient bigotry for its own sake. It was a deliberate strategy to maintain boundaries, to prevent assimilation, to keep the identity intact. It was harsh, it was painful for the families involved, but from the perspective of communal survival, it worked. Later, when the Greeks conquered the region and tried to spread Greek culture, making everyone adopt Greek language, Greek customs, Greek religion, the Jewish community resisted. They fought wars to maintain their distinct identity. The Maccabean revolt was not just about political independence. It was about the right to remain Jewish, to keep kosher laws, to observe the Sabbath, to circumcise their sons, to maintain all the practices that marked them as the chosen people of God. And they won, at least temporarily, because enough people believed that these practices were not negotiable human customs, but divine commands given to the chosen nation. When the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, the pattern repeated on an even larger scale. Once again, everything physical that defined Jewish identity was lost. The temple was gone, never to be rebuilt. The land was lost, with Jews eventually banned from even entering Jerusalem. The priesthood was gone. By normal historical standards, this should have been the absolute end of Jewish identity. But it was not. Because by this point, after centuries of development and reinforcement, the concept of being chosen had become so deeply embedded that it did not need a temple or a land or a political structure. It existed in the hearts and minds and practices of the people themselves. They were chosen, therefore they maintained the laws. They maintained the laws, therefore they remained distinct. They remained distinct, therefore they survived as a recognizable people for the next 2,000 years. Think about how extraordinary this is. Name another ancient people who lost their homeland, had no state, no army, no political power, and yet remained a distinct, identifiable community for 2 millennia. You cannot, because it did not happen. The Jews are unique in this regard. And Spinoza's argument is that they are unique not because God actually chose them in some cosmic sense, but because they created a belief so powerful that it achieved what no military force or political structure could achieve. They survived the unsurvivable through the strength of an idea. But this survival came at a cost, and Spinoza was honest about that too. The same belief that preserved Jewish identity also isolated Jews from surrounding populations. The same laws that maintained distinction also made Jews seem strange, foreign, threatening to others. The same refusal to assimilate that kept the identity alive also provoked suspicion, resentment, and eventually, persecution. The concept of being chosen, which was designed to protect the community, also made the community a perpetual outsider, never fully accepted in any land where Jews did not rule. This created a tragic dynamic that has played out for centuries. Jews needed to maintain distinction to survive, but that very distinction provoked hostility, which made survival even more precarious, which reinforced the need to maintain distinction even more strictly. Spinoza saw this dynamic clearly because he lived it. His own community, the Portuguese Jews of Amsterdam, were refugees from persecution. They had fled the Inquisition, watched family members burned alive, practiced their Judaism in secret, at risk of torture and death. His power, when they finally reached Amsterdam, they were determined never to compromise again, never to bend, never to allow their identity to be threatened. And when Spinoza started asking questions, when he started suggesting that maybe some of these beliefs were human constructions rather than divine revelations, they saw him as an existential threat, not because he was factually wrong, but because questioning the basis of chosenness threatened the very mechanism that had kept them alive. This is the tragedy at the heart of Spinoza's story. He understood why the belief was necessary. He respected the genius of it. He recognized that it had accomplished something extraordinary. But he also believed that once you understand how the belief emerged and what purposes it served, once you see that it is a human construction rather than a cosmic fact, you have to be honest about that. You cannot treat a survival strategy as if it were a divine decree. You cannot claim that human needs and human cleverness are the same as God's will. And for that honesty, his community expelled him. Someone tried to kill him, and he died alone, poor, and still condemned. But Spinoza's larger point was not just about the Jews. He argued that every nation, every empire, every powerful group throughout history has done the same thing. They have all claimed special status, divine favor, unique destiny. The Romans believed they were destined by the gods to rule the world. The Christian Church claimed it was the one true path to salvation. Islamic empires believed they were spreading the religion God intended for all humanity. Modern nations have claimed to be chosen for special missions, whether spreading democracy or preserving civilization or leading humanity into the future. The pattern is universal. Groups that want to maintain cohesion and justify their power claim that they are special, that God or history or destiny favors them above others. Spinoza's insight was that once you recognize the pattern, once you see that every group does this, you realize that these claims cannot all be true. They cannot all be chosen. They cannot all be specially favored by the infinite divine. Either none of them are chosen, or chosenness is something different from what they claim. Either it is all human construction serving human purposes, or we need a completely different understanding of what divine favor means. And Spinoza argued for the first option. These are human claims, serving human needs. They are powerful, effective, often necessary for group survival, but they are not cosmic truths. They are not facts about how the universe is ordered. They are stories groups tell about themselves. This does not make the stories worthless. It does not mean communities should abandon their identities or traditions. It does not mean that Jewish history and wisdom and resilience are any less impressive. In fact, Spinoza argued that recognizing the human origin of these beliefs makes them more impressive, not less. It means that humans, through their own creativity and determination, found a way to survive circumstances that should have destroyed them. It means that the Jewish people did not passively receive divine favor and coast on God's protection. They actively created a belief system so powerful that it sustained them through 2,000 years of exile, persecution, and near extermination. That is a testament to human strength, human wisdom, human will to survive. It does not need to be validated by claiming God personally chose them above all others. The achievement stands on its own. The political proof completes Spinoza's argument. The philosophical proof showed that an infinite God cannot logically choose favorites. The textual proof showed that the biblical documents are human creations compiled over centuries. The political proof shows exactly when, why, and how the concept of chosenness emerged and evolved in response to specific historical pressures. Together, these three proofs form an argument that has stood for 350 years. They have been attacked, criticized, disputed, but never successfully refuted. And that is because Spinoza was not making an emotional argument or a prejudiced attack. He was following evidence and logic wherever they led. He was reading texts carefully, thinking about concepts precisely, and examining history honestly. What makes Spinoza's argument so powerful is that it respects what it analyzes. He never said the concept of chosenness was stupid or primitive. He called it brilliant. He never said the Jewish people were foolish to believe it. He said they were ingenious to create it. He never said the belief served no purpose. He said it served one of the most important purposes imaginable: survival against impossible odds. What he did say is that brilliant, necessary, effective beliefs can still be human rather than divine. And once we recognize them as human, we can appreciate them for what they truly are: extraordinary examples of human creativity and resilience, rather than treating them as cosmic facts that must never be questioned. This is the lesson Spinoza leaves us about the concept of being chosen. It was not a gift from heaven. It was an achievement of human wisdom. It was not revealed on Mount Sinai. It was developed over centuries by communities fighting for their lives. It was not static and eternal. It evolved and intensified as circumstances changed and threats grew. Understanding this does not diminish Jewish history or tradition. It reveals them to be even more remarkable than claiming divine favor could ever make them. Because surviving 2,000 years without a homeland, maintaining identity without political power, preserving wisdom and contributing to human civilization while being persecuted and expelled and nearly destroyed, that is not a story of divine favor making everything easy. That is a story of human determination and brilliance finding a way when there should have been no way. And that story, Spinoza would argue, is more inspiring, more worthy of respect, and more honest than any claim of cosmic chosenness could ever be. So where does this leave us? We have traveled through 3 centuries with Spinoza, examined his 3 proofs, seen the philosophical logic, the textual evidence, and the historical patterns. We have seen how he was excommunicated, nearly murdered, and condemned for generations. We have seen how his books were banned and burned. And we have seen how his ideas, despite all attempts to destroy them, not only survived, but became the foundation for modern biblical scholarship and religious freedom. Now we must ask the harder question. What does all of this mean? Not just for understanding ancient history, but for how we live today, how we think about identity, how we respond to claims of special status, and how we navigate a world where groups still insist they are chosen, blessed, or destined above all others. Let us start with what it means for Judaism itself. This is delicate territory, because questioning the concept of being chosen strikes at something deeply personal for many Jews. For 2,000 years, through unimaginable persecution, the belief that they were chosen by God gave meaning to suffering, strength to endure, and reason to maintain identity when assimilation would have been easier. The Holocaust, the pogroms, the expulsions, the forced conversions, all of this horror was bearable, or at least survivable, because of the belief that Jewish suffering was not random, but part of a larger divine plan for a chosen people. To question that belief can feel like stripping away the one thing that made survival possible. But here is what Spinoza would say, and what many modern Jews have come to recognize. You do not need divine chosenness to value Jewish tradition, history, and identity. You do not need to believe God picked you above all others to be proud of Jewish contributions to philosophy, ethics, law, medicine, science, and art. You do not need cosmic favoritism to respect the extraordinary resilience of a people who maintained their identity for 2 millennia without political power. In fact, recognizing that this survival was a human achievement rather than divine protection makes it more impressive, not less. It means that Jews did not coast on God's favor. They actively created, maintained, and defended their identity through intelligence, determination, and communal solidarity. That is a story of human strength, not divine preference. Modern Judaism reflects this evolution. Reform Judaism, which represents a significant portion of Jews worldwide, has largely moved away from the literal interpretation of chosenness. Many Reform Jews understand being chosen not as cosmic superiority, but as having a particular mission to pursue justice and ethics. Some reinterpret it as being chosen to serve rather than to rule. Others quietly set it aside as a relic of ancient thinking that no longer serves contemporary Jewish life. And many Jews who identify as secular or cultural maintain deep connection to Jewish identity, tradition, and community, without believing in chosenness at all. Spinoza, expelled by his community for heresy, pioneered the path that millions of Jews now walk, the path of being proudly Jewish without claiming divine election. But Spinoza's argument extends far beyond Judaism. That is why his ideas remain urgently relevant today, because the pattern he identified, the pattern of groups claiming divine favor or special destiny to justify their power and maintain their boundaries, that pattern has not disappeared. It has merely changed its language. We no longer hear many nations explicitly claim that God chose them above all others, though some still do. Instead, we hear about exceptionalism, about unique national character, about being the greatest country on earth, about having a special mission to spread values or protect civilization. The language has become more secular, but the structure is identical. We are special. Our cause is righteous. Our dominance is justified. And those who resist us are not just opponents, but enemies of what is good and right. Look at American exceptionalism. The belief that the United States has a unique role in history, that it is a city on a hill, that it is chosen to spread democracy and freedom to the world. This belief has been used to justify everything, from westward expansion that destroyed native populations to military interventions across the globe. It functions exactly like religious chosenness. It gives meaning to national identity. It justifies actions that might otherwise seem questionable. It creates a sense of purpose that unites citizens. And it makes criticism of national actions feel like a tax on something sacred. When you believe your nation has a special destiny, that it represents the best hope for humanity, then opposing your nation's policies becomes not just political disagreement, but betrayal of a higher cause. Or look at nationalism across Europe, Asia and the Middle East, where leaders invoke ancient histories, pure bloodlines, and sacred missions to mobilize populations. They speak of protecting traditional values, of defending their unique culture against contamination, of fulfilling historical destiny. They create enemies, foreigners, outsiders who threaten the purity and purpose of the chosen group. And ordinary people, seeking meaning and belonging, embrace these narratives, because humans need to feel part of something larger than themselves. We need stories that tell us we matter, that our struggles have purpose, that we are not just random accidents in an indifferent universe, but part of some greater plan. Spinoza understood this human need. He did not mock it or dismiss it, but he also saw the danger, because when you believe you are chosen, you inevitably believe others are not. When you believe your nation has a special mission, you believe other nations are obstacles to that mission. When you believe your group possesses unique truth or virtue, you believe other groups lack that truth or virtue. And from there, it is a short step to believing that your chosenness justifies actions you would never accept from others. It justifies taking land because God gave it to you. It justifies war because you are spreading what is right. It justifies discrimination because you are protecting what is pure. The logic of chosenness, once accepted, becomes a tool for rationalizing actions that pure reason would condemn. This is why Spinoza's method remains so important. He taught us to ask certain questions whenever anyone claims special status. Ask who benefits from this belief. Ask what actions it justifies. Ask whether the same reasoning would be acceptable if applied by a different group. If Americans can claim exceptionalism to justify intervention, can China claim the same? If Israel can claim divine promise to justify settlement, can Palestinians claim the same land by ancestral right? If European nations can claim cultural superiority to limit immigration, can other nations claim the same to exclude Europeans? So, calmly thinks, the logic of chosenness only works if you believe your group is actually special in a way others are not. But when you recognize that every group makes similar claims, the whole structure collapses. Either everyone is chosen, which makes the concept meaningless, or no one is, which forces us to justify our actions by reason and ethics rather than by claimed divine favor. Spinoza offers an alternative vision. Instead of dividing humanity into chosen and unchosen, into superior and inferior, into those who matter more and those who matter less, we can recognize our shared nature. We are all humans, born without choice into particular circumstances, inheriting particular traditions, speaking particular languages. None of this makes us cosmically special, but all of it makes us human. And our shared humanity, our common capacity for reason, our mutual need for compassion, these provide a foundation for ethics that does not require anyone to be chosen above others. We can value our own traditions without claiming they are divinely superior. We can be proud of our own histories without insisting they are uniquely blessed. We can maintain distinct identities without building walls of cosmic significance around them. This vision is not naive universalism that erases all differences. Spinoza was not saying everyone is the same or that particular identities do not matter. He was saying that particular identities are human creations shaped by history and circumstance, valuable for what they contribute to human flourishing, but not validated by cosmic decree. You can love your culture without hating others. You can honor your ancestors without claiming they were divinely favored. You can maintain your traditions without insisting God commanded them. And when conflicts arise, as they inevitably do, you can negotiate based on human needs and rights rather than on claims of divine entitlement that can never be resolved, because both sides believe God is on their side. The practical implications are profound. In Israel and Palestine, where competing claims of divine promise have turned what could be a solvable political dispute into an unsolvable religious conflict, Spinoza's approach offers a way forward. If both sides could see their narratives as human stories rather than cosmic truths, if both could recognize that their claims come from history and need rather than from God's real estate decisions, then negotiation becomes possible. Not easy, not simple, but possible. When you believe God gave you the land, there is no room for compromise. When you recognize that you and your community need the land for human reasons, and so does the other community, then you can talk about how to share it, how to make it work for both peoples, how to find solutions that respect both histories. In America, where the language of exceptionalism often blocks honest reckoning with historical injustices and current policies, Spinoza's method asks uncomfortable questions. If we are truly exceptional, truly the greatest nation, truly chosen to lead the world, then why do we have such high poverty, such racial inequality, such resistance to acknowledging our genocidal treatment of native populations and centuries of slavery? If our mission is truly to spread freedom and democracy, why do we support dictatorships when convenient, and overthrow democracies when they threaten our interests? These questions are not attacks. They are applications of the same critical reasoning Spinoza applied to the Bible. They are asking whether our national narratives match reality or whether they serve to justify power and avoid accountability. In every context where groups claim special status, whether religious communities claiming divine favor, nations claiming unique virtue, or movements claiming historical necessity, Spinoza's questions apply. Show me the evidence. Explain the logic. Demonstrate why your claim is different from the identical claims made by others, and if you cannot do this, if you can only assert mystery or insist on faith, then be honest that what you are claiming is a belief that serves your group's purposes, not a fact about how the universe is ordered. There is no shame in admitting this. Every group has beliefs that serve its purposes. The problem comes when we pretend these beliefs are cosmic truths that must be imposed on others or used to justify our actions against them. Now let us return to Spinoza himself, to the price he paid and the legacy he left. He died in 1677 at the age of 44, his lungs destroyed by years of breathing glass dust in his workshop. He died alone, poor, still under the cherem pronounced against him 21 years earlier. He died knowing that his most important work, the Ethics, would not be published in his lifetime because it was too dangerous. He died condemned by every religious authority in Europe, Jewish and Christian alike. By every conventional measure, his life was a failure. He was cut off from his community, denied academic position, lived in poverty, and died young with his greatest ideas unpublished. But the ideas survived. Within hours of his death, his friends gathered his manuscripts and smuggled them to a printer. The Ethics appeared anonymously within months. The ideas that religious authorities tried so hard to suppress began spreading across Europe. And slowly, over decades and then centuries, what seemed like dangerous heresy began to look like pioneering insight. By the late 19th century, scholars were recognizing that Spinoza had been right about the composite authorship of the Bible. By the 20th century, his approach to reading scripture historically had become standard in academic study. Today, what got him excommunicated is taught in rabbinical schools. What nearly got him killed is now accepted by millions of believers and non-believers alike. This is the ultimate proof of Spinoza's central claim. Truth has a power that persecution cannot destroy. Ideas based on evidence and reason outlast ideas based on authority and tradition. You can ban books, but you cannot stop people from thinking. You can condemn thinkers, but you cannot prevent their thoughts from spreading. You can kill the person, but you cannot kill the idea. Spinoza's life proved the very point he was arguing. Human constructions, even powerful ones like religious authority or claims of chosenness, cannot stand forever against honest examination. They may survive for centuries, they may adapt and evolve, but they cannot remain unchanged when subjected to the kind of rigorous analysis Spinoza pioneered. The torn cloak he kept, the one that nearly cost him his life, became a symbol, not of victimhood but of courage, not of the danger of asking questions, but of the necessity of asking them despite the danger. As Cloak said, "This is what seeking truth costs. This is what honest inquiry risks. This is what happens when you refuse to pretend that human beliefs are divine facts." And the fact that Spinoza kept it, that he did not hide it or throw it away but displayed it as a reminder, shows that he understood the bargain he had made. Truth in exchange for safety, intellectual freedom in exchange for social belonging, honesty in exchange for comfort, and he believed the exchange was worth it. We live in a world that desperately needs Spinoza's courage and his method. We live in a time when groups are retreating into claims of special status, when nationalism is rising, when religious fundamentalism is growing, when every tribe insists on its unique virtue and destiny. We live in a time when facts are called fake if they contradict what people want to believe, when expertise is dismissed if it challenges identity, when asking for evidence is treated as attack. In this context, Spinoza's insistence on reason over dogma, evidence over tradition, and shared humanity over tribal superiority is not just historically interesting, it is urgently necessary. The question Spinoza asked about Judaism, was this people truly chosen by God, is really a question about all of us. Are we willing to examine our most cherished beliefs honestly? Are we willing to recognize that what serves our purposes might not be cosmic truth? Are we willing to see that every group tells stories about itself that make it feel special, and that recognizing these as human stories rather than divine facts does not make them worthless but makes them honest? Can we find meaning and identity without claiming to be better than others? Can we be proud without being superior? Can we value our traditions without insisting God commanded them? Spinoza's answer was yes, we can and we must, because the alternative is endless conflict between groups that each believe God chose them, each believe history destined them, each believe their cause is righteous and their enemies are evil. The alternative is a world where compromise is impossible, because giving an inch feels like betraying divine will. The alternative is what we see around us every day. People willing to kill and die for beliefs they cannot prove, identities they cannot question, and superiority they cannot demonstrate except by force. Spinoza offers a different path, a path where we maintain our identities and traditions but hold them lightly, where we are proud of our histories but honest about their all-too-human origins, where we find meaning not in being chosen above others, but in choosing every day to live with reason, compassion, and integrity. This path is harder because it offers no cosmic validation, no divine guarantee, no promise that we are special in the eyes of God. But it is more honest. And, in the end, Spinoza believed that honesty, however difficult, is the only foundation on which humans can build a world where we live together in peace, rather than in constant conflict over whose story is the true one, whose God is the real one, whose people are the chosen ones. The answer to the question in the title, was Judaism actually chosen by God, is no, but the deeper answer is that no one is chosen in that way. Not Jews, not Christians, not Muslims, not any nation or people or group. As we are all equally human, equally here, equally trying to make sense of existence and find meaning in our brief time alive. And that equality, that shared struggle, that common humanity is more than enough. It does not need to be validated by cosmic favoritism. It needs only to be recognized, respected, and used as the foundation for how we treat each other. That is the lesson Spinoza risked everything to teach. That is the truth he believed was worth dying for. And that is the legacy that outlasted every curse, every ban, every attempt to silence him. The truth that we do not need to be chosen to be worthy. We need only to be human and to have the courage to live as if that were enough.